39 seconds. That's all the time there was between the first earthquake and the second one in Venezuela this June. Not minutes, not hours, 39 seconds. And in those 39 seconds, the ground was already shaking so violently that people couldn't stand upright. Building Gs were already cracking apart. People were already screaming in the streets. And before any of that even stopped, before anyone could process what was happening, the second earthquake hit. Bigger, harder, more powerful. A country already on its knees hit twice in under a minute. And that was just June. That was just 1 month out of an entire year that has produced 11 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or above, with 4 months still left on the calendar. 11 catastrophic earthquakes, and the math says 5 more are coming before this year is over. That's not a guess. That's not fear-mongering. That's what the statistics say. So let's walk through every single one of these 11 earthquakes, in order, region by region, and by the end, you'll understand exactly why 2026 has felt like the planet is tearing itself apart, and why the real explanation is more complicated and in some ways more important than the Earth is changing. The first magnitude 7 earthquake of 2026 struck on February 22nd, near Kudulu Day in Malaysia, magnitude 7.1. Here's the detail almost nobody talks about with this one. It happened at a depth of 629 kilometers. That's roughly 391 miles beneath the surface of the planet. Think about that distance for a second. That's nearly 400 miles of solid rock between the rupture and the ground you'd be standing on, because the seismic energy had to travel that enormous distance. Before reaching the surface, the shaking people actually felt was dramatically weaker than a magnitude 7.1 would normally produce. Nobody died. No buildings collapsed. It was unsettling, but not catastrophic. Hold on to that depth number, because the relationship between depth and destruction becomes the single most important thread running through this entire year. Then came March. On March 24th, a magnitude 7.5 struck near Tonga at a depth of roughly 234 kilometers, another deep one, again limiting the surface impact. 6 days later, on March 30th, a magnitude 7.3 hit near Vanuatu. Then, only 2 days after that, on April 1st, a magnitude 7.4 struck east-southeast of Bobenaro in Indonesia. Sit with that sequence for a second. A 7.5, then a 7.3, then a 7.4, 3 separate magnitude 7+ earthquakes in a little more than a single week. If you were watching a global earthquake map at that point, it already looked extraordinary. And it wasn't finished. On April 20th came the Sanriku earthquake off the coast of Japan, magnitude 7.4 to 7.5, striking along the Japan Trench. 10 injuries were reported in Japan, 10 from a magnitude 7.5. That number alone tells you something remarkable about Japanese engineering, and we'll come back to exactly why in a few minutes, because it becomes the key to understanding everything that happens later in this year. After that came a stretch of relative quiet in the magnitude 7 range. A few weeks where it seemed like maybe this had just been an unusually busy spring and things would settle down. They did not settle down. They got dramatically worse. On June 7th, southwest of Cotabato on the island of Mindanao in the Philippines, a magnitude 7.8 struck. This became the single largest earthquake of 2026. It occurred at relatively shallow depth, and the consequences were devastating. More than 100 people lost their lives. Buildings shook violently across the region. Tsunami warnings went out along Philippine coastal areas. People ran. People screamed. Entire communities were thrown into chaos in a matter of seconds. Unlike the deep Malaysia quake back in February, this one hit close and hit hard, striking people exactly where they lived. That 7.8 in the Philippines was, up to that point, the worst thing the Earth had done in 2026. 17 days later, the Earth did something almost impossible to comprehend. On June 24th, in the evening hours, people across Venezuela were eating dinner, watching television, going about ordinary life in Caracas and along the coast near La Guaira. At 6:04 in the evening local time, a magnitude 7.2 Earth Q. Huaque struck near San Felipe, roughly 284 kilometers west of Caracas. The shaking began, people ran outside, and 39 seconds later, before that 7.2 had even finished, a magnitude 7.5 struck near Yumare, 293 kilometers west of the capital. Seismologists described that first 7.2 as a foreshock to the larger 7.5, meaning the bigger earthquake was, in a sense, always coming, just seconds behind the one that announced it. Together, those two earthquakes, striking 39 seconds apart, created one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in Venezuela's history. In one state alone, an estimated 80% of buildings collapsed. 80%. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Concrete towers pancaked floor onto floor, people trapped in darkness. Screaming, with no way of knowing if help was coming. The death toll from Venezuela has been genuinely difficult to pin down precisely, in part because of the country's restricted media environment, but the scale that has been reported is staggering. In the days immediately following, confirmed deaths climbed by the hour, crossing into the thousands within weeks. By the 1 month mark, officials had put the death toll in the low thousands, with tens of thousands more injured. By August, reported figures had climbed into the several thousands range for deaths, with tens of thousands more injured or hospitalized, and tens of thousands still listed as missing. International humanitarian officials were reportedly preparing for the possibility that the final toll could climb dramatically higher still. Hundreds of thousands were left homeless, and well over 1 million people, including a huge number of children, were left needing humanitarian assistance. Given how enormous these figures are, and how difficult information has been to verify out of the region, these numbers deserve to be checked against updated reporting rather than treated as a final, settled count. But even the most conservative version of this event ranks it among the most devastating earthquakes anywhere in the world in recent memory. This wasn't just an earthquake. This was a civilization-level catastrophe for one country, delivered in 39 seconds. So here's the question that has to be asked, because it's the most important one in this entire story. Why was Venezuela hit so much harder than Japan? The Japan earthquake in April was also close to magnitude 7.5. 10 people were injured. In Venezuela, thousands upon thousands are confirmed dead. How can two earthquakes of nearly identical magnitude produce such wildly different outcomes? The answer is depth and building quality, and once you understand this, the rest of 2026 makes a lot more sense. The Japan earthquake struck at a depth of about 35 kilometers along the Japan Trench, and Japan has some of the most advanced seismic building codes on the planet. Structures there are engineered specifically to survive major earthquakes. Older buildings have been retrofitted over decades. Entire engineering careers are built around making sure that when a major quake hits, people can walk out afterward. Venezuela is a completely different story. The earthquake struck close to densely populated communities, filled with buildings that were never designed to withstand major seismic events, poorly reinforced concrete structures built decades ago with no meaningful earthquake engineering standards behind them. When a shallow magnitude 7 earthquake strikes underneath a city built like that, you get exactly what happened. Pancaking, entire floors collapsing onto each other in sequence. That is not fundamentally a geology story. That is a building code story. That is a poverty and infrastructure story. Seismologists had reportedly been warning for years, in some cases for decades, that this part of Venezuela sat in a seismically dangerous zone. But the political and economic will to address it was never there. That's one of the real tragedies buried inside this disaster. Moving into July, on July 17th, off the southern coast of Mexico, a magnitude 7.3 struck at an extremely shallow depth of about 19 kilometers, roughly 12 miles down. A shallow earthquake like that hits the surface hard and close, and tsunami warnings went out along the Mexican coast. People evacuated and damage was reported along the coastline. Then, on August 10th, near San Jose de Palmar in the Chaco Department of Colombia, a magnitude 7.4 struck with an epicenter only about 5 kilometers from that densely populated town. Colombia's own geological survey reportedly described this as the largest earthquake recorded in the country during the entire NTY first century. At least 300 people were killed. The earthquake itself occurred at a depth of around 110 kilometers, which provided some measure of protection. But even at that depth, the destruction was enormous simply because the epicenter sat so close to a populated center. 5 days later, on August 15th, on Flores Island in East Nusa Tenggara, Indonesia, a magnitude 7.7 struck at a depth of only about 10 kilometers. 10 kilometers is almost the surface in earthquake terms. The shaking was violent in Imedi. Buildings and homes collapsed. Roads were blocked by landslides. A major highway was cut in multiple sections. Communications went dark in parts of the region. Indonesia's Meteorological and Geophysics Agency issued a tsunami warning almost immediately, and coastal residents ran for higher ground. A tsunami did follow, with waves reported up to about 1.5 meters, striking more than a dozen locations across 4 Indonesian provinces. More than 5,000 people were evacuated. Well over 1,000 homes were damaged, and hundreds were completely destroyed. Then came the aftershocks, and this is where Flores becomes genuinely extraordinary by historical comparison. More than 1,400 aftershocks were recorded in the days following the main quake, some large enough to be felt strongly by residents who were already too afraid to sleep indoors and were living under tarps in the open instead. Reported death tolls from Flores climbed toward the high 60s to 70 as search efforts continued through collapsed buildings and landslide debris, with figures still being updated as recovery work continued. That's 11 earthquakes of magnitude, 7 or above in 8 months. Malaysia, Tonga, Vanuatu, Indonesia, Japan, the Philippines. Venezuela twice, 39 seconds apart. Mexico, Colombia, Indonesia again. Lay that list out and look at it as a whole, and the question everyone ends up asking is the same one. Is something changing on this planet? Are the tectonic plates becoming more active? Is there some kind of domino effect moving through the crust? Is 2026 the beginning of something genuinely different? Here's the honest answer, not the panic answer. Long-term data on global seismicity suggests the Earth produces somewhere around 16 major earthquakes per year on average, with roughly 15 of those falling in the magnitude 7 range, and approximately one re-aching magnitude 8 or greater in an average year. Compare that baseline to 2026. 11 earthquakes through mid-August, with 4 months remaining, works out to an expectation of roughly 4 to 5 more before December 31st, purely based on historical averages. That's where the 5 more to come figure comes from. Not a prophecy, not an intuition, a statistical expectation drawn from the long-term average, which is worth stating clearly is exactly that, an expectation, not a guarantee of a specific number arriving on a specific schedule. Essay. Seismologists who have run this exact comparison have reportedly found that the expected count through this point in the year, based purely on historical statistics, sits close to 11 or 12. In other words, 2026 is not dramatically above the long-term average in raw earthquake count. It's remarkably close to what an ordinary year looks like, statistically speaking. So why does it feel so extreme? Why do the images coming out of Venezuela and Indonesia feel so different from other years? Why does 2026 feel like the planet is tearing itself apart if the numbers are basically normal? The answer is where these earthquakes landed. Look back at last year when a massive magnitude 8.8 struck Kamchatka in Russia, the largest earthquake anywhere on Earth since 2011. Ask yourself how many people died in that 8.8. And the honest answer is very FUW compared to what you'd expect from an earthquake that size. Kamchatka is a remote peninsula. The closest major population center wasn't directly under the rupture zone. The energy released was enormous, but human exposure was low. Now compare that to the Venezuela earthquakes, magnitude 7.2 and 7.5, both signifying intially smaller in terms of released energy than that 8.8, but striking within a few hundred kilometers of Caracas, a city of several million people, in a country with aging, poorly constructed buildings, a healthcare system already strained by years of economic crisis, and a restricted media environment that made even gathering basic casualty information difficult in the immediate aftermath. This is the real story of 2026. Not that the Earth is producing more earthquakes than normal, but that several of this year's earthquakes happened to strike exactly where they could cause maximum human suffering, close to dense populations, in regions where buildings weren't built to survive shaking, in CE immunities where emergency help was hard to reach quickly. A shallow earthquake has far greater potential to produce intense ground shaking nearby, but whether that shaking becomes a catastrophe or a frightening but survivable event depends enormously on what's sitting on top of that ground. Here's the physics in simple terms because once it clicks, the rest of the year makes complete sense. When an earthquake happens 629 kilometers down like Malaysia, in February, the seismic waves have to travel nearly 400 miles through solid rock before reaching the surface. As they travel that distance, the energy spreads out and weakens substantially. By the time it reaches the top, the shaking is far gentler than the raw magnitude number would suggest. But when an earthquake happens 10 kilometers down, like the Flores earthquake in Indonesia, those waves reach the surface almost instantly at full power with no time to dissipate. That's why a magnitude 7.7 at 10 kilometers can cause dramatically more damage than a magnitude 7.8 at 100 kilometers, even though the 7.8 technically released more total energy. Now, the question that always comes up, are these earthquakes connected to each other? Is Venezuela somehow triggering Indonesia? Is there a chain reaction moving through the tectonic plates? It's an incredibly tempting idea, especially when you look at a map and see the Philippines, Venezuela, Mexico, Colombia, and Indonesia all clustering around the Pacific Ring of Fire, the horseshoe-shaped belt of plate boundaries circling the Pacific Ocean, responsible for roughly 90% of the world's earthquakes. Naturally, seeing earthquake after earthquake along that belt looks like a chain reaction. But the mainstream science doesn't support that picture for earthquakes separated by thousands of miles. Here's how plate tectonics actually works. These plates are moving constantly at roughly 5 to 7 centimeters a year, about the speed your fingernails grow, incredibly slow. But let that motion build stress along a locked fault for a century, 2 centuries, 3 centuries, and it accumulates until the fault can no longer hold, and it ruptures. That process happens independently along active plate boundaries all over the world, all the time, on their own separate timelines. The fault system beneath the Philippines doesn't respond to what's happening in Venezuela. The Flores fault in Indonesia isn't waiting for Mexico to finish. Each region carries its own stress load and its own timeline, and sometimes, by chance, several of them happen to reach their breaking point within the same year, or even the same month. That's not a conspiracy or a hidden connection. That's statistics playing out across thousands of independently active fault zones. Here's a number that puts the whole picture in perspective. Worldwide, roughly 20,000 earthquakes are recorded every single year, which works out to about 55 earthquakes a day. Every day. Most are small, most are never felt, most never make international news, and most never produce the kind of images that came out of Venezuela's pancaked towers or Flores Island's cracked, landslide-blocked roads. We experience earthquakes as abstract statistics when nothing bad happens as a result. We experience them as human tragedy when the numbers happen to collide with vulnerable populations and poorly constructed buildings. That collision is exactly what happened repeatedly in 2026. The numbers were not exceptional. The human exposure was. There's one more piece of this year that deserves its own attention. The aftershock sequences, specifically what followed the Flores earthquake in Indonesia. The scale of aftershock activity after that August 15th magnitude 7.7 has reportedly been extraordinary by historical comparison, with more than 1,400 aftershocks recorded in the Desos Wayas following the main shock, some described as more intense in that same time window than the aftershock sequence following the massive 9.0 plus Tohoku earthquake that devastated Japan in 2011. Large aftershocks kept arriving, strong enough to be felt clearly, strong enough to key up thousands of people living in tents outside their own homes because going back inside felt too dangerous. Scientists are reportedly still working to understand exactly what the scale of this aftershock sequence means for the region going forward. ARD. Around the same period, Spain also experienced its own smaller sequence, a magnitude 5.2 initially thought to be the main event, followed by aftershocks that in some cases grew rather than faded, rattling buildings that had already sustained damage and unsettling residents who believed the worst had already passed. So where does all of this leave us? Here's the complete, honest picture. Is the Earth producing an abnormal number of massive earthquakes in 2026? Based on the available long-term statistics? No. 11 magnitude, 7 plus earthquakes through mid-August sits close to, and arguably even slightly below, the historical expectation for this point in the year. That might be the single most surprising fact in this entire story. It doesn't feel that way because of where these earthquakes struck and what they destroyed, but the raw count is not extraordinary. Does that mean things are calming down? No. With 4 months left in 2026, the historical average suggests we should expect somewhere around 4 to 5 more magnitude 7 or above earthquakes before December's, or 31st, and there's a real statistical chance of at least 1 magnitude 8 or greater before the year ends, given that the long-term average puts one such earthquake at roughly once per year, and 2026 hasn't produced one yet. Could one of those remaining earthquakes be as catastrophic as Venezuela? Honestly, yes. If a magnitude 7 or larger earthquake strikes at shallow depth near a major population center in a country without strict building codes, the outcome could be just as devastating, or worse. That's not doom-mongering. That's simply what the underlying probabilities allow for. What seismologists studying active zones around the world, from the Cascadia subduction zone off the Pacific Northwest coast, to the Hayward Fault near San Francisco, to the fault systems running through Central and South America, and the subduction zones of Southeast Asia, have been saying for years, that preparation saves lives. Better building codes save lives. Earthquake early warning systems save lives. Retrofitting older buildings saves lives. Venezuela had warnings about its seismic risk. Indonesia has had warnings. The Philippines has had warnings. The real question has never really been whether the risk exists. It's always been whether the political will and the economic resources exist to act on that risk before the earthquake happens, rather than after. Because here's the truth about 2026 that's hard to argue with. The planet is not behaving abnormally. It's doing exactly what it has always done. Moving plates, releasing accumulated stress, rupturing locked faults. What makes 2026 feel different is the human side of the equation. This year, several major earthquakes happen. To strike close to people who were especially vulnerable. And those images, the pancake towers in Venezuela, the cracked roads and devastated coastal villages in Indonesia, the collapsed buildings just kilometers from a city center in Colombia, are real. The pain behind the M is real. The loss behind them is real. Thousands dead in Venezuela, tens of thousands injured or hospitalized there, tens of thousands still reported missing. Dozens dead in Indonesia, with the count still being updated. Hundreds dead in Colombia. Lives permanently altered across the Philippines, Japan, Mexico, Tonga, and Vanuatu. If your gut reaction to all of this is that something feels wrong, that this year feels different, that these images have arrived too fast and too often, that reaction is not irrational. It's a completely human response. When we see this much devastation compressed into a short period of time, our minds naturally search for a pattern because that's what human minds are built to do. We look for meaning inside chaos. We look for a reason. That instinct isn't a flaw, it's part of what makes us human. But the reason 2026 feels so relentless isn't that the Earth itself has changed. The reason is that the Earth did what it has always done. And this year, it happened to do it right where people were living, right beneath communities that weren't prepared, right under buildings that were never built to survive it. The real question isn't whether the Earth is becoming more dangerous. The plates are going to keep shifting. The faults are going to keep accumulating stress and eventually releasing it. That part is certain, and it always has been. The real question is whether we're doing enough to make ourselves less vulnerable to a danger that has always existed. And that part, unlike the earthquakes themselves, is actually within our control. If you live in an earthquake zone, know your evacuation routes. Know exactly where to go the moment shaking starts. Know what to do in the first 39 seconds. Because sometimes 39 seconds really is all the warning you get. And if you're watching this from Venezuela, from Indonesia, from Colombia, from the Philippines, know that people around the world have seen what your countries have been through this year and are thinking of you. What communities in those regions have endured in 2026 has been extraordinary, and it deserves to be remembered accurately, not just as a frightening headline, but as a call to take earthquake preparedness seriously wherever you live, long before the ground ever starts to move.